Okay, I think it's time for us to start. So, dear all, I welcome you to the 11th lecture of the online course on East Caucasian languages. My name is Anna Volkova. I am a research fellow with the Linguistic Convergence Laboratory, which organized this course, and I will moderate today's lecture. Our speaker today is Oleg Belyaev, and he will talk about clause combining in East Caucasian languages. I will start with a few household rules, and then I will introduce the speaker. So our lecture today is recorded, and it is also streamed on YouTube, and it will be stored there afterwards. The lecture will go uninterrupted, followed by a question period. To improve the sound quality, all the participants will be muted. And if you encounter any problems, I ask you to report them in chat. I will keep an eye on chat for these cases. Also, if you would like to ask a question, you can either send it to the Zoom chat or to the YouTube chat. I will collect all the questions and forward them to the speaker. We will try to address as many questions as possible, but I apologize in advance if not all the questions will be covered by the speaker during the Q&A period. Okay, and now to the introduction of our speaker today. It is my pleasure to welcome Oleg Belyaev in our course. Oleg is a lecturer at the Department of Theoretical and Applied Linguistics at Lomonosov Moscow State University, and the research fellow at the Department of Typology at the Institute of Linguistics, Russian Academy of Sciences. He works on Iranian and North Dagestanian languages, primarily Ossetic and Dargwa, and has quite wide research interests that cover clause combining, like questions of coordination and subordination, correlatives and converbs, also typology of case systems, and formal grammars. He is an active contributor to the lexical functional grammar community. Together with Diana Forker, Oleg is a project leader of LexCauc, which is a project aiming at creating an open access comprehensive lexical database for the languages of the Caucasus. This project is hosted at the University of Vienna and the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History. And the project will allow to use quantitative statistical and phylogenetic tools for inferring the origins, dispersal and timing of the expansion of the Caucasian languages. Oleg has published in journals like Language, Journal of Linguistics, Journal of Quantitative Linguistics, Linguistic Typology, Iran and Caucasus, and Вопросы языкознания. And I thank Oleg for agreeing to present for us today, and I give him the floor.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this introduction, and I'm honored. I'm very flattered by what you said, and I'm honored to be one of the lecturers here in this course alongside such remarkable specialists in East Caucasian languages. Let me now share the screen and show you the presentation. Okay, so I will go to full screen mode now. The title of this lecture, which is called Clause Combining in East Caucasian Languages, might seem to be extremely broad, and this is because it is actually very difficult to come up with a specific title for the specific range of topics that I'm going to discuss, because clause combining by itself is a term which actually encompasses all kinds of means of getting clauses together, from coordination to subordination, relative clauses, complement clauses, adverbial clauses, and so on. Of course, each of these topics by itself can be a very deep treasure trove for discussing innumerable problems. I will focus on only one salient aspect of clause combining, which I think is especially important in the East Caucasian context, that is the syntax of clause chaining or coordination. That's a complicated topic, and we will discuss how we could approach it, and adverbial clauses, which are closely related because in East Caucasian languages, both clause chaining, both discourse, the combination of clauses and various adverbial relations are expressed by morphological means using converbs. At the same time, I will not discuss complement clauses and relative clauses because these will be discussed during the next two lectures, actually, the remaining two lectures. And even though, of course, even in these areas, there is much overlap with adverbial clauses. But I think we will not have time today to discuss, for example, the question of how converbs can be used in complementation and similar topics. So we will focus on clause chaining and adverbial clauses. And a very salient feature of East Caucasian languages that is shared with other languages, with most other languages of North Eurasia, of the North Eurasian macro area, is the lack of at least the lack of a well grammaticalized and frequently used construction that structurally corresponds to what we are accustomed to call coordination in our standard average European languages. So what is coordination as we are accustomed to see? This is a construction where you have two clauses, two or more clauses, all of which have the same morphological and syntactic status in the sense that all of them are non-deranked in the terminology of Leon Stas and Sonia Christopher and other authors, so they do not have any difference with predicates. The predicates in these clauses have no difference with predicates in independent sentences in form or in the range of categories that are expressed. So in European languages, when we coordinate several clauses, we have the same normal finite verb form, so-called finite verb forms, which is also actually a complex problem in East Caucasian finiteness. And secondly, usually in our languages, let's say in languages that are commonly understood to be European languages, there is usually the conjunction, one conjunction that stands between these two clauses. There are various variants, but this is kind of the prototypical case of what linguists usually call coordination. So it's not the case that it doesn't exist, but it's not the main means in most East Caucasian languages. This is not the main means of combining clauses. This is not the main means of chaining sentences, clauses in discourse. Similarly, there are, with very few exceptions, no object that corresponds to what we could call subordinating conjunctions. Of course, there are certain markers, complementizers, if you want to call them this way, which act to introduce various kinds of subordinate clauses, but these are usually morphological affixes which attach to the verb form. And a conjunction in our traditional understanding, some kind of element that stands at the edge of the clause and is just selects again a normal finite form, a normal full-fledged verbal form. This is not typical for East Caucasian. What is typical is to use for both functional types, for both kind of chaining of events in narratives and for expressing specific adverbial relations. East Caucasian languages use more or less the same range of strategies. First of all, so-called general converbs, that is perfective or imperfective converbs that do not encode any specific semantic adverbial relation, but rather serve as a very broad marker of clause relationships. Specialized converbs, which have different markers, which correspond to different kinds of adverbial relations, such as temporal, causal, concessive, conditional, and some other less typologically widespread types, which we will also take a look during this lecture. Also, relational nouns are used very, well, maybe not very extensively, but for some adverbial relations. East Caucasian languages use relational nouns, which are simply morphological and syntactic nouns that attach a relative clause, a participial clause, but encode adverbial relation, such as at the time when something happened, when you have the noun time, and a participial clause which precedes this noun. And finally, there is also the option of using juxtaposition of finite clauses, which perhaps is the closest counterpart to what we can call coordination. So in this very narrow sense, these languages do have coordination. It's just not used that extensively, with the exception of a few languages like Lesbian, which have been claimed in some literature to use this construction to a larger extent, perhaps due to external influence. And in these constructions, also sometimes you can find, especially in written languages, conjunctions borrowed from Arabic, like wa, which is and amma. Well, amma is borrowed in Arabic. It has a different meaning, but in East Caucasian, it's usually borrowed through Persian or maybe Azeri, and it has this meaning but, which is typical for Persians, for example. But originally it is from Arabic. But these conjunctions are very infrequently used in the majority of languages, with the exception of maybe some very special, very Russian-influenced types of text, of written texts, where you have a tendency to use to employ coordination. So normally the main construction types are general converbs, specialized converbs, and these relational nouns. These are the main means of combining clauses together to form adverbial and chaining relations in discourse. So to illustrate these types, for example, from Shiri Dargwa, actually these could be illustrated from any language, but I just wanted to illustrate this from the language which I'm most familiar with. So for example, a general converb. You have the form in the imperfective. When Ali went to work, he saw Murad from time to time. So habitually, when he used to go to work, he saw Murad from time to time. So the final form at the end of the sentence, this is a finite syntactic verb form of the so-called preterite from the imperfective stem, which has a kind of, usually it has a habitual in the past interpretation. And the semantics of the subordinate clause, first of all, in many respects, it's connected to the semantics of the main clause verb. For example, it also denotes a habitual action, right? When he used to go to work, he also used to see Murad from time to time, but it doesn't encode any, in this case, it encodes a temporal relation that's during each time when he did this, he saw Murad, but in other circumstances, it could encode a causal relation, perhaps a conditional, an adversative relation, and so on. So there's no specific meaning that is associated with a converb, only the aspectual semantics. Now there's also a conditional, a specialized converb, which expresses more or less, which is used in similar contexts, but in this case, it has a more specific semantics. So the example 2 has this conditional form, which is used maybe perhaps a bit atypically for such forms in this Dargwa branch, because here usually it's used for conditionals proper, and here this is more like a temporal habitual converb. So it means that whenever, kind of like English ever, right? Whenever Ali drove to work in the morning, the policeman stopped him every day. So whenever he drove, the policeman used to, the gaishnik, right? This Russian loan word, the gaishnik used to stop him. And again, you have the main clause verb in a finite form, and in Dargwa it's actually finite even from the Indo-European point of view, from what we're accustomed to, because it has this person inflection. So in Dargwa also we have a very clear distinction between finite and non-finite forms in the morphology, because finite forms have person inflection and non-finite forms generally don't, although there are certain paradigms which are used mainly in subordinate clauses, but nevertheless have person inflection. But generally we can see in this example that this final form is marked for person. It's also a form which is only used in independent sentences, and this is a special form whose main function is to mark conditional or, well, this kind of habitual temporal subordination. And the relational noun is illustrated by an example like 3, which is translated as when Murad went down from the mountain, Ali went up. And as you see, when he went down is expressed by the noun zamana, which is, of course, also a loan word from Persian eventually. And this word has a participle which it precedes it. Basically, from the syntactic point of view, this is a noun phrase which is headed by a noun time and a certain participle. And we will see during the, not the next lecture, but the lecture after the next one, how these guys behave in East Caucasian. Basically, participles relativize any semantic role in the subordinate clause. And in this case, they kind of relativize the temporal relation, the temporal localization. So this kind of promiscuity of participles is what leads to this situation that you can use relational nouns to a very large extent. So you can just put the noun time, a subordinate clause, a participle, and you get the temporal relation. This is what Bernard Comrie calls GNMX, GNMCC, a generalized noun modifying clause construction. So this is kind of a very general subordination construction, which just takes a noun, takes a participle, and you get any kind of relation between the noun and the participle and the clause. And a few perfective examples. So, for example, a very typical use of the perfective converb is when you get a sequence of events in discourse. Like in 4, well, this is a bit of of course, an artificial example where we'll see below how it's used in the texts. Murad came back home and went to sleep. So you have, again, this converb form, and you have a finite form. And the translation equivalent is exactly what you see in English, the coordinating construction. So of course you could translate it as having come back home, Murat went to sleep in this case. But actually the converb clause can have its own subject, and we will see this in a little while. And in this case, of course, this is not a direct counterpart to English gerunds. So in principle, these converb clauses inside in the internal structure is exactly the same as the structure of main clauses, but morphologically the verb is deranked. It's not used independently as a rule, and it doesn't. Sometimes it doesn't. In some languages, it doesn't express all the categories which are expressed in main clauses. A specialized converb example again. So when I heard your voice, I became happy. You have a temporal converb which specifically encodes temporal relation. So in for, this is in this case again, this is a temporal relation, but it could have been a causal relation, for example, because Murat came home. In this context, maybe it's not very it's not very felicitous, but in another context, it could well be a causal relation or anything else. In a specialized converb construction, if you have a temporal converb, you always get a temporal relation. So that's the difference between general and specialized converbs. So let's now take a closer look at general converbs. What is a general converb? This is not a term which is just an ad hoc term for East Caucasian. This is a typological term which is due to Vladimir Nedialkov, and from this very famous paper from 1995 from the book Haspermath and Koenig. And it is used to describe a specific type of converb that has no, as I said already, has no specific adverbial clause function, and whose exact function is determined only by the context, by the specific interpretation that is most salient in this situation. So it could be temporal sequence, it could be a manner interpretation, like he walked limping, for example, with a limp, right? It could be a verb with a converb form, but it has a meaning that only expresses a manner of the action. It could be cause, as I said, it could be adversativity, it could be anything else. And in this respect, general converbs are functionally, semantically similar to coordination, because coordination is also characterized by being able to express various kinds of semantic relations. Again, I'm not going to discuss how exactly coordination describes these relations and how it is different from subordination. This is a very complex topic because there's a lot of discussion in the literature regarding whether the specific uses of coordinate constructions are kind of in the semantics of this construction, they are kind of a polysemy pattern, or it is just the semantics of the construction itself is rather vague, and you only get these specific discourse relations or semantic interpretations because of specific contextual effects, kind of like an implicature. So there is a big deal of literature on this, and of course we can't discuss these theoretical questions. It suffices to say that from the point of view of describing East Caucasian languages, you get more or less the same functional range of interpretations for converbs as for coordinate structures. And what is important, what I already mentioned, is that which is important to mention for people who are not accustomed to, shall we say, North Eurasian or East Caucasian languages, is that there is no obligatory argument sharing. So we are perhaps people who are more accustomed to Indo-European might believe that when you have a converb, it presupposes that the subject of the converb clause is somehow controlled by the subject of the main clause. So as a rule, there is no such argument sharing. So the converb clause can have its own subject, object, it can completely full argument structure. There are no differences in argument expression. There are no changes from nominative or ergative to genitive, anything like this of the subject, right? And there are certain effects associated with the same subject, which we will discuss closer to the end of this talk, but this is nothing similar to the kind of obligatoriness that we are accustomed to from Indo-European, for example, controlled converb constructions. So this next slide illustrates a piece of a text where you have an extensive use of converbs, and this is just an illustration of how salient they are in discourse. So this is an excerpt from a narrative about a situation during the war, basically, when there was in this village a problem with the telephone connection, and there were hard times. There were bandits operating, and they cut down the telephone because they wanted to attack the village and take some supplies and so on. And so this is about women who went to the local party organizer to ask him, well, I don't know what, I don't remember, so to ask him to restore the connection or something like this. And so the text, you have several, as you see, they are marked in bold, several converb forms. So you have, first of all, the verb to say in converb form, which actually just introduces the name of this person. So this Halum Omar, who said that this telephone connection was turned away, so torn away. So this is just this converb is not a close chaining device. Here it's just used as a kind of introductory marker for this proper name. So then he says this Hello Momar was a party organizer in Ashti, and this is a finite clause because this has a participle or a kind of an aorist form and a copula. So this copula this unambiguously identifies this clause as being finite. So you first have a finite clause, then you have they went to him. So agulei hesha, there is no agreement because the verb just happens not to have a gender agreement slot, but from the context it's clear that this is about these women. So they went to him, they let him know. So you have the subject and the plural ergative. So they went to him, they let him know, also a converb. They told him the news, again a converb. So as you can see here, Bahi Bikra Belyaev, this is a converb, and the subject is in the ergative. So you have full argument expression. And here, finally, you have a finite clause. He puts a lot of shame on our Kunki people because they sent women to tell and not men. That's the point, right? Because they, how did they send women and they didn't send men? So you only have the finite verb here and all the events that preceded. So they went, they let him know, they told him the news. They all are marked using these perfective simple converbs, which morphologically actually in this language are just combinations of a kind of aorist or participle form and the general adverbial marker, which also, for example, derives adverbs from adjectives. So they are just basically simple adverbial derivatives of perfective stems. But this is only one language. In general, the morphological, if we're talking about the morphological means of deriving converbs, general converbs are very diverse. So in this case, we saw on the previous slides, it's relatively transparent because you have a clear difference between finite forms on the one hand and these converbs, which clearly have this adverbial subordination marker. So of course, these converbs in Dargua, for example, they can also be used in certain periphrastic forms, but these periphrastic forms always have certain predicative markers, which mark them as actually being finite. But this is not the case in all East Caucasian languages. In fact, in some, or maybe even in most languages, this is very, I didn't count. I think this is more or less 50%. Also depends on the specific type of converb. For example, some languages have anterior converbs that behave in one way and imperfective converbs that have different forms. But in many languages, these converbs are formed directly from the base stem, and they are homonymous, at least synchronically, kind of from the descriptive point of view, they are homonymous with one of the basic tense aspect forms, which might also have other functions. For example, Andi from Samira's recent paper has the following system of forms in the perfective, where you have the past tense big O, and the same form is the aorist, which is used in independent sentences for a kind of unmarked past tense forms, and the same form is also a converb. So you see that the participle is different because it has this gender marker at the end, but the converb, I think it's a gender marker, and the converb is, well, it's exactly the same as the aorist. And in the perfect, again, you have the perfect form, which is derived using a specific kind of morpheme, and the converb has exactly the same form. And in the general case, when you have a sentence which has a converb and a so-called finite form, it is impossible to automatically answer whether we deal with coordination of two finite clauses or actually converbial subordination. So there are different criteria to disambiguate. For example, you could argue that the predicative use of the converb or the corresponding finite form has a different semantics. For example, it has a very specific perfect semantics, and the converb might have a more general semantics. But here, for example, in Andi, it's very difficult to say so because actually the synthetic form is just the aorist. It's the main narrative form. So it's very difficult to say whether we have two narrative forms or a converb. Actually, in Andi, this is disambiguated using a system of special particles, which is what Samira's paper is about. So in Andi, actually, we can tell the difference. But in many other cases, we cannot. So in Sahur, for example, from this famous paper by Konstantin Kazenin and Yakov Georgievich Testerets, you see that there is this form which they gloss as perfect, which is, well, a converb. But it's also the synthetic, the perfect form which can be used in independent sentences. So a sentence like 7 can be interpreted as Aminat having said this word, Rasul left, but it could also be interpreted as Aminat has said this word, and Rasul left. Of course, you have different forms here. So this is a different verb form than this one. So this could be an argument in favor of treating this as converbial subordination, because otherwise maybe it's hard to explain the use of the perfect here. But in the general case, the sentence is ambiguous. You could say that it involves two finite clauses, and actually that's how the text of that they write actually makes it appear as if this ambiguity gives rise to the coordination-subordination problem, because as it stands, the sentence is ambiguous. But in fact, I think this is too strong a statement, because even in languages where converbs are morphologically quite distinct from finite forms, even in languages where we can clearly see that the converb form is subordinating, still they might have a number of coordinating properties that we will see. So this an important point that I would like to make here, and which we will also see later empirically, is that there is no dependency, there's no necessary relation between morphological subordination that is being deranked or somehow dependent in the sense of not being able to be used in independence at the end of an independent sentence, and subordinating properties. So morphological subordination does not necessarily imply syntactic or semantic subordination, if you want to use this term. Right. Still, the notion of finiteness in East Caucasian and what it actually takes to be a finite form is rather complex. And there is a nice overview by a fairly old but still very relevant overview by Elena Karenina and Nina Sumbatova about the problem of finiteness in East Caucasian languages. Because you have these predictive markers, you have these converts which sometimes are used independently, and this is a complex matter. And in such cases, of course, this is a big question. It's both synchronically and diachronically. Do we deal with just an unmarked form, which happens to be used promiscuously in different contexts, or we're dealing with ambiguity, which is just a historical accident, or well, maybe some other analysis is possible. And in the general case, again, I don't think we can answer this question at present, and still there are some different opinions on this topic. And for example, Elena Kalinina at some point advocated that these forms are actually such form that there are forms in languages which are unmarked for finiteness, as it were. But other analyses, of course, are possible, and I guess this has to be resolved on language by language basis, and this is pretty much, as a general question, this is pretty much an open question at present. Well, as I said, some languages have a more clear differentiation between converbs and other forms. For example, in Dargwa, as I said, we have in general a rather clear system. Again, it depends on the variety, but for example, Sheri is very clear, because in Sheri we have the stem, we have the participle, which is derived using perfective and imperfective, derived using different suffixes in most conjugation classes. And then we have the converb derived from the participle using this li marker. And as you see, the finite form is either kind of the least marked form in this language is a totally unrelated aorist, synthetic aorist form, or again, a periphrastic form which uses this converb as the base, but it has this predicative marker, which is obligatory to appear. So here we don't have any problem. If we see this form, we can obviously see that it is it is a converb clause. It is a chaining clause. Well, technically, this is a bit more complicated, because the participle, for example, can also be used as a perfect form. So, but it has a very special semantics and very restricted in use. Also, the converb can sometimes be used independently, but also it's used in very special circumstances like murativity and so on. So in the general case, when we have a narrative and when we have a text, when we have elicitation, whatever, we can very easily see that we're dealing with a converb. So this is the case in Dargwa, for example. This is not necessarily the case in other languages. This is important to understand. And of course, there is a complex story behind this situation. And for those who are interested, I directly to one attempt to solve it, which is my paper from 2018. Well, what we typically have in this family in general is polysemy, is either a dedicated converb form or the polysemy of the converb with some of the finite forms, which might go back to a predicative use of the converb, but as I said, not necessarily. Another type of polysemy, which is comparatively rare in this family, but of course it's frequent elsewhere, but in this family it's relatively rare, is participle converb polysemy, when you have the same form which doubles as a participle and the converb. For example, it's found in gush and in krys. And for example, in some languages, like in Ashti again, a different kind of Dargwa variety, this is actually clear. It is actually very clear where it came from, this kind of polysemy. This is a kind of historical accident of sorts, because the converb marker, which we saw just in the previous slide, was lost in converb forms. but retained in finite forms which derive from them. For example, you have the participle bakib. Converb has the same form, but the finite form, the perfect, has bakib p, which goes back to bakib li. It's the regular phonological change in Ashti. So you have the old form retained as a finite form, and the copula got lost in the third person. But in other forms, you have an exact convergence of participles and converbs. But this is the result of just a historical change. Because in Kubachi, which is very closely related, we see that this li still exists in certain. It's already moribund, but it exists in certain forms. And here we see that it's completely lost. There is no morphological difference, at least not in the normal regular verbs, between participles and converbs. But this is probably in this case a result of the reduction of the converb marker. In Ngush, it seems the situation is different, because in Ngush, as far as I know, there is no evidence for such change, because the converb is clearly, well, I mean, there is no no indications that there has been some sort of reduction of this kind. And actually, Joanna Nichols writes in her grammar that distinguishing two forms is somewhat artificial. And this only calls for these anterior converbs, the main close chaining device. So you see in Ngush, you have different forms for imperfective participles and converbs, but you do have this participle converb polysemy in the past or perfective stem system. And as you can see, the finite form is different. So this is a different polysemy pattern than the one we see, for example, in Andi. So this is kind of some more or less everything I wanted to say about the morphology of general converbs. Now, the specialized converbs are also just like general converbs. They are very diverse, and the inventories of specialized converbs are, as we can expect, very rich, because I have already mentioned that specialized converbs basically express all kinds of adverbial clause relations. And this means that if we don't have any other means, we just have a bunch of forms which we have to use to express various kinds of everything we need in the clause combining system. There is the systems are different in detail. So some converbs are found, some are absent, but in general, we can say that many languages have some sort of locative converb, which actually some authors call a participle, because of course it might seem more like a participle, but terminologically, kind of from the point of view of definition, if a converb is called a adverbial verb form, a verb form that has an adverbial function, it means that a locative has to be treated as a converb, because it's used, it has attached spatial case markers and denotes adverbial meanings like lative and essive. So from this point of view, this locative is a converb, and that's what Denikra said, for example, how he describes it. Then you have a bunch of temporal converbs, which express various kinds of meanings, like after the event, at the same time as the event. These are very typical, but there are some less typical. For example, just before the action occurs means that the event in the subordinate clause didn't have time to occur, and then suddenly it was interrupted somehow by some other event. Sorry, this is about non-posterior, this last one, and this is different. This is just before, and this is what I said. This means that the event somehow started to occur, or at least was planned to occur, but somehow, due to some circumstances described in the main clause, it didn't. Then you usually have conditional and concessive converbs, which could be related. For example, here we can clearly see that the concessive form is actually the conditional form with the additive particle also, and this is again typologically widespread, and also widespread in East Caucasian. And you have various additional forms which are more exotic and which do not occur in all languages, but still they recur in different branches of the family. For example, simulative, so in the same way as X, so it's not expressed by some sort of relational noun. Sometimes it's expressed by a relational noun. For example, you have a word like manner, and then you have, as in other cases, just a participle clause, and this has the meaning in the manner of some action. But in many cases, you have a converb, which has this simulative meaning. Gradual, also that's very interesting. I will show some examples in a few moments, because in these constructions, in a lot of theoretical literature, they're called comparative correlatives, but in East Caucasian, they are not correlatives. They're expressed by a special kind of converb. I mean, not in all languages, but in many of them. So you have gradual, which means the more, for example, the more you walk, the more you get tired. So this is expressed by a special converb in many cases. And not by a correlative as we're accustomed to in English, for example. And a converb, a causal converb, well, Denis calls it explicative, but usually a more frequent term is causal, and some sort of a supine or a purposive, which is quite typical. It could be an infinitive, of course, but could be a separate form, distinct from the infinitive, which is used in complementation. So here I more or less describe the same thing I said. So the Ahvach system is very typical because it includes all these types of converbs. So a bunch of temporal ones, a locative one, conditional, concessive, causal, purposive, and these strange meanings. So some examples, for example, the locative converb from the newspaper. I worked 2 years in a tea house, but the house is not marked by a noun house, but or by the verb to sell in the locative essive converb form. So basically, the literal translation is the place where tea is sold. So at the tea selling place. But morphologically and syntactically, this is you get this verbal locative suffix, and that's it. This becomes a locative, and it attaches all the normal locative case markers. In this case, essive. So you get the you derive the new converb, and this converb behaves just like an adverbial. Well, you already heard a lecture about how locative forms behave in East Caucasian. So this is just a normal locative form which reflects in the same way as all other locative forms. This gradual, which I already mentioned, so this kind of comparative in a certain sense. The higher we climbed, the closer it became. So you see, we basically doesn't even, well, in this case, this ak is high, so I included in the verb because it becomes like climb means to become higher. So kind of the higher we became, or the higher we climbed into the mountains, the colder it became, but there is no the colder. The cold is just an adjective cold, and this is just the past continuous form of the verb to become or to be. So you just get a converb marker, this gradual converb, which expresses the semantics of gradual change. I'm not aware of any detailed analysis of how exactly the semantics of this construction work. I'm just illustrating that this meaning is very typical. Not very typical, it's not everywhere, but it recurs in different languages to express this gradual, this to be used in this context. Simulative, this example from Hwarshi. So again, you could have a language, and you do have languages which have relational nouns like manner, but very often you have something like 10. So the father got up early in the morning. So having stood up early in the morning, he found the horse outside, and the subordinate clause is as the sun had set. So you have the verb say, the sun in the ergative, and the converb marker is this. You get the converb marker which expresses the simulative semantics, as the boy, the sun had said. And finally, a very exotic kind. I don't think I have encountered it anywhere except Archie, is this so-called imperative converb described, for example. Well, it was described, of course, in the grammar, but Nina also had a paper on this. Basically, it's used when you have a situation, if you have a clause, an imperative in the main clause, and you want to enforce the interpretation that the elocutionary force of the imperative spreads over both clauses, you can use this. It's not obligatory. You can also use the general converb, as far as I know. But if you want to enforce this wide scope interpretation, you use a special imperative converb. So this is very exotic, very strange, unusual, but it exists in Archie. Okay, so regarding relational nouns, I don't have much to say about relational nouns. Maybe the lecture on relative clauses will have more information, but I just want to stress that actually, when we talk about specialized converbs, we are describing a very heterogeneous class from the morphological and from the syntactic point of view. Because for many reasons, but one of them is that the border between relational nouns and lots of other parts of speech used in adverbial functions, for example, verb forms which denote various adverbial relations and so on, and specialized converbs are somewhat fuzzy. Because relational nouns make grammaticalize. And even synchronically in some languages, the converb markers might be treated as borderline between nouns and other parts of speech or affixes. So consider, for example, the situation in Ashti Dargwa where some of the so-called converb markers can easily attach to nouns and adjectives. For example, you have, of course, I mean, a separate question is the syntactic analysis. We could say that these are small clauses or something like this, but diachronically, this seems pretty much a situation where you have a shift from maybe a case marker or a relational noun used with a participle and a morphological converb. For example, this temporal form in Ashti, it's mutil, which actually goes back to the noun murt, which means time period. And it's also interrogative, which means when, but this is probably an extension of the original meaning. And the form to which it attaches is actually a participle morphologically, where it's also an aorist form, but it's in other dialects. But in Ashti, it's clearly a participle. So in principle, only the fact that this mutil is not used as a noun anymore motivates us to call it a converb and not a relational noun construction. But you can also attach this time to an adjective like drunk, for example, kep, which is of course from kai for cave. So kep mutil, being drunk, when he was drunk or when he is drunk. So you can attach this marker to adjectives just like you can attach it to verbs. You can't attach it to a noun, but you can attach some other markers to nouns. For example, jila, which is for since, it probably goes back to a case marker, and so you can easily attach it to a noun as well. The simultaneous can attach to all three, also to very frequently these guys attach to demonstratives like at that time and so on. Causal and concessive, all of them can attach to at least a noun or an adjective. So this brings the question of whether we can actually call these markers converbs in the strict sense, because if they are so promiscuous, maybe they are more properly called some sort of formatives, which are more maybe even complementizers, or of course they're morphologized to a certain extent, more morphologized than other nouns. They can't be than the real relational nouns. They cannot be used independently and so on. But in principle, from the point of view of the system, they are kind of, this is not a clear division between these specialized converb markers and relational nouns. Of course, some again, this all goes with a number of caveats, because there are some specialized converbs that are clearly very strongly morphologized and which don't have this behavior. But when you get lists of like 20 different specialized converbs, of course, not all of them are grammaticalized to the same extent. And many of them might just be something like these borderline categories. That's important to understand. And this, I guess this applies to all such systems. For example, case systems very often also, not maybe in East Caucasian, where this locative category is very salient and grammaticalized, but in other languages like Hungarian, for example, when you have different estimates of the number of cases, because the border between cases and adpositions is not so clear. So here you have a similar situation. It's the category of specialized converb is borderline between a converb and some other kinds of things. So now I would like to discuss how these adverbial systems work. So from what I just said, it might seem that East Caucasian languages have generally very similar systems of these specialized converbs. So we saw in the case of general converbs that while the systems themselves seem to be similar, the markers themselves and the place of these converbs in the morphological systems are quite distinct. So in some languages they are the same as participles, in other languages they're indistinguishable from finite paradigms, in yet other languages they are completely separate forms. And with specialist converbs the situation is different. And actually Hassel, when he discusses this situation in Ahwach, he goes to the conclusion that even in two Ahwach varieties you have again a similar range of functions but different forms. And his conclusion is that these systems probably are not something which is stable and which could have been inherited from the proto-language at some point maybe, but these are systems which undergo constant renewal but still preserve the main traits of their makeup. And I have a similar impression from Dargwa languages, and here is a kind of micro typology of these specialized converb markers in this table from 4 varieties, and in a few slides I will show you a bit more varieties. So as you can see, so for example, let's take a look at the temporal converb. So here you have a kind of similarity between the Tsari, Kunki, and Shiri, but in Ashti we have a different marker. So already at the level of at least this Kubachi and Ashti, one of the branches, sub-branches of Dargwa, you have a different converb, which might have been a replacement, might have been something else, we never know. Might have been an innovation, and this might be inheritance, it's difficult to say. Immediate converb, you see immediate simultaneous, that's very interesting because you see that, for example, this her marker in most dialects is used for simultaneous meanings, which means at the same time as, but in Kunki it's used for immediate precedence, as soon as. So these guys can either grammaticalized independently from some unstable original system or shifted their meanings very freely. In Kunki instead has, for the simultaneous meaning, it has a totally different marker, which is actually elative from the locative converb. And Itsari has this katla, which is also found in some other dialects, as we will see. So this is totally unrelated to anything else. And Ashti has ma'ale, Shiri has ma'ala, which could be related. But Ashti is also similar to the causal in ma. So again, which doesn't exist in other varieties, which is unique to this branch. Anterior, again, you have this hitti, letti, which is a contraction from lehitti, which is basically a converb form plus an adverb, which means after. So this is just means after having come. It's not even clear whether this is a converb actually. And Ashtik is the stabeli, which doesn't have a counterpart I'm aware of. And hilai, which is also in that position. So in principle, you can just see from this table that, of course, there are some gaps. For example, some languages don't express some of the meanings. Some have more, some have less. But in principle, the overall system is similar. But the markers themselves, you are not uniform. So you have a lot of constant. You probably have a lot of innovation replacement going on, while the general systems are similar. So this illustrates the same point. So for example, kind of a map. It's not in rough geographic distribution. So for example, the when converb, which has the marker heli in the so-called northern varieties, mutil in Kubachi, and kila in the southern ones. So yes, this corresponds to the areal division, but if we look at the other converbs, it becomes mismatching, because for simultaneous converb, which means at the same time you have her for these guys and ala for mihuep and tanti. So you have a different pattern yet again. And this doesn't correspond to this pattern. And for after, we have yet another pattern where we have hella for tanti and kubachi suddenly, which doesn't actually have any sense. Well, it's not the exact form, it's just kind of the abstract underlying form which describes this. Means that these have related forms. Of course, they might be different in the dialects, but one could put an asterisk here. It's not a reconstruction, it's just a label for the etymologically related forms. These guys suddenly have leheti, and there's some kind of overlap in tanti, and chia suddenly appears on two different extremes. Maybe it's a proto-language. Archaicism, we don't know, but what this illustrates is that these systems are very unstable. They are not preservable, and in principle, they probably undergo a lot of change, even though they are kind of central to the system. And as soon as as soon as it has yet another distribution, yet different from the other converb meanings. So actually, simple converbs are more stable within branches. They are probably not stable across branches because they have different systems, but at least within branches they are stable. But these semi-specialized converbs are not stable even within a single branch of very closely related languages, to such an extent that even they are traditionally treated as one language. So even if Dargwa, which is treated as one language, has so much diversity, it's clear that these systems are by no means stable. Okay, so this was more or less everything I wanted to say about the morphology. And now I would like to at least attempt to discuss the main syntactic question of converbs, that is the distinction between coordination and subordination, a hot topic which, in my opinion, does not yet have a completely satisfactory resolution, but at least I would like to underline the main problems that occur, the main distinctions, and then maybe some of you or someone else in collaboration will try to discover this, because unfortunately this topic, on the one hand, it has been discussed for a long time, but on the other hand, there's comparatively little written on this topic than about other questions. For example, about anaphora, you have a lot of more work in East Caucasian about coordination and subordination. You have less because, unfortunately, this doesn't lead to very pretty pictures, because you have a lot of tests, and these tests don't, very often they don't cluster together in any meaningful way. So maybe we just haven't discovered the ways in which they cluster. So as we saw above, from the point of view of translation equivalence, East Caucasian general converbs correspond to coordination. And the natural question arises whether the properties are also the same, right? Because we could hypothesize that even though these guys are morphologically subordinated, they could have some sort of coordinating meaning, in the coordinating properties. The problem is that the distinction itself is very problematic in typology and in theoretical linguistics. And some typological references include, for example, Foley and Van Veren, which introduced the idea of co-subordination, Haspermath, 1995, who discusses the application of this thing to converb, and these papers, Kurikova and Jekindorf, Joassadek, and my own paper, which developed the idea of multi-level definitions of coordination subordination and mismatches between them. And Baltzar-Bickel, for example, applied, tested the tests, sorry for the repetition, on a sample and found that there is not much clustering. So at one point, a very popular approach was to just kind of define a bunch of tests based on what we know about languages for which we are comfortable with telling what is coordination and what is subordination, and then just applying this battery of tests to constructions of various languages. I cannot say that it has proven to be very successful because, well, you do get the results of applying, let's say, 10 tests. And then you get one construction which has 10 pluses for all the tests, another construction, well, we can say, okay, it's coordination. You have another construction which has 10 minuses for the same range of tests, and you can be pretty sure that it's coordination. And then you have a construction which has 3 pluses and 7 minuses. And you have another construction which has 4 pluses and 6 minuses. So would you say that one is 30% coordinating and the other is 50% or 40% coordinating? This doesn't seem to be very enlightening, right? If you just look at the tests and count the number of pluses. And things get worse because not often do these, very often these pluses, these tests, the results of these tests cluster in the same way. So one construction could cluster in one way, and in the other construction, different tests could give different results. And then maybe one solution, so one possible solution, is to just say that, well, this means that we should abandon the notion. That's what is implicitly assumed, for example, in work which uses balancing and deranking typology, because it doesn't explicitly condemn this distinction, just replaces it with a less problematic, typologically problematic distinction between the expression of various categories in forms, in close combining. So either you have balancing forms or deranking forms. So this is one option. We just say, well, we don't care about coordination and subordination. It is an artificial Eurocentric concept, and it cannot be defined as a comparative concept. You could also try to define a comparative concept just using one test. You can say, well, this test is the correct, it is the mother of all tests, and we will call a construction which complies subordinating and which doesn't coordinating. Well, you can do it terminologically, but it doesn't seem to be very enlightening again, because you have to find what correlates with these tests. And as we see, it seems little things do correlate, as we see from, for example, Bicker's paper. So the question is generally still unsolved. Maybe there's a theoretical approach which could work, but the theoretical approach requires deep analysis of each language, which is simply not available for East Caucasian. So I could just direct a plea for more in-depth analysis of converbs in East Caucasian. But as it stands, we are at a situation where we don't have detailed data for all varieties, but I will still show you some tendencies which seem interesting and which require further investigation and exploration. Because even if we have to abandon the traditional notion, binary notion of coordination and subordination, we still have, applying this test, we still have discovered a lot of interesting things about how these guys work, about what happens with converbs in different contexts. So some properties and their illustrations, some of the traditional properties which are generally used in the literature. Center embedding, this is a bit hard to illustrate based on English, because English doesn't allow center embedding as freely as, for example, Russian. So this test is very language specific. So center embedding in principle is the possibility to put one of the clauses inside the other clause. And we assume that if you can put one clause inside the other clause in terms of linear order, then we can call it subordinating. Well, in English, you can do it when you have an adverbial on the left edge. For example, last year when she entered the university, Mary was very happy. And with gerunds, apparently, you can do the same thing. Last year, having entered the university, Mary was very happy. That's fine. With coordination, you can't do this. You can just juxtapose the two clauses, put the conjunction between them and nowhere else. You can put it inside one of the clauses. You can put it at the end or in the beginning. And you cannot embed one of the clauses. Well, I have here just one illustration, but whatever you do, trust me, you won't be able to embed this. You won't be able to say last year and she was very happy Mary entered. Last year and Mary entered the university, she was very happy. You can't do it. So with coordination, this doesn't work. Linear order, again, coordination is usually assumed. So when you have a subordinating construction, you have a specific adverbial clause marker, a subordinator that expresses a specific temporal or a specific semantic relation. If it's a temporal relation, it's either anteriority or posteriority. And it doesn't matter where you attach this clause because the marker itself has all the information. So, for example, in English, when you have a when clause, you can put it before the main clause, and then the order of the clauses will correspond to the temporal sequence of events. When you came, I saw you, right? If when is used with the past simple. But you can put it at the end as well. I saw you when you came, and you also get the same semantic interpretation. You do not get the opposite. You still have the interpretation that the person first came into the room or whatever, wherever they came to, and then the speaker saw them. This doesn't, as by default, we will see a bit later that this is a bit more complicated, but by default, this doesn't occur with coordination. So coordination has this implicature, at least an implicature, that the linear order of clauses must correspond to the sequential order of events. For example, in this, you came and I saw you is fine. I saw you and you came. Well, it's also fine in a specific situation where I saw, for example, a person in the window and then they came into the room, but not in the same sense as this sentence. So out of the blue, if you don't have any special context which cancel this implicature, and maybe I'm not prepared to argue this as a general theoretical idea, but I would say that in many cases this is more of an implicature than part of the semantics of and. But kind of out of the blue, if we take just the isolated sentence, of course everyone would agree that this is interpreted as a sequence where first you came and then I saw you, and this one is interpreted as the opposite sequence of events. Then the test, which, for example, Yakov Georgievich Tistelets calls morphosyntactic locus, that is the location. So when you have a subordinating clause, only the main clause verb, well, it also applies to non-verbal coordination and subordination, but let's focus on clauses. If you have if you have coordination, when you assign some feature to a coordinate structure, it has to distribute over all the conjuncts. So all the conjuncts morphosyntactically mark dependency on the matrix verb. For example, in English, the verb demand requires, at least in one of its configurations, requires this kind of subjunctive form without the S. Right? I demand that John ask questions and Bill answer them. And as you see, this form has to be used in both conjuncts, because kind of if you imagine a line which goes from demand, it goes to the coordinate structure, and then you kind of distribute over the structure because these are symmetric, and you assign the same feature to all the conjuncts. So however many of them there is, you get the same morphological marking on all of them. With subordination is different because only the matrix clause is the locus of external marking. It's supposed to be, okay, so there are exceptions as usual, but in principle, as you see from this example, if you replace coordination by subordination, I demand that Bill answer questions when John asks them. That's ungrammatical because you only assign the feature to the matrix clause. The subordinate clause is already part of this complement. It's not available for external feature assignment. So this is the idea of morphosyntactic locus. In a coordinating construction, each of the clauses on its own is the morphosyntactic locus. In a subordinating construction, only the main clause. The rest just has the same marking that it has within the subordinate clause. It doesn't go up. You can't go deeper, and you can't assign a feature from here to the subordinate clause. You can't go over the matrix of the subordinate clause. And finally, well, there are many more tests, but the most important ones. There are also a number of scope tests, which are related to scope of elocutionary force, focus, negation, and these are very important, but these are very difficult to discuss during this lecture because that requires a lot of theoretical background and additional assumptions. So I will only illustrate the most, perhaps the simplest tests. The coordinate structure constraint is the constraint introduced first by Ross in 1967, and this prevents syntax from extracting stuff from from components of coordinate structure. So in a subordinate structure, you can extract something from a main clause. You can just take the main clause, extract some argument from the main clause, but the subordinate clause is completely stays the same. So you can do things with the main clause, and the subordinate clause is not modified. In contrast, and you cannot extract anything from both the main clause and the subordinate clause, like in this example. But with coordination, actually, this is the only thing you can do. It's called across-the-board extraction, and from coordinate constructions, you can extract across the board. You can just take one NP, for example, and take it out of both conjuncts, and it works fine. What does John buy and David sell? So if you extract from both, this works. But if you extract from only one, and it doesn't matter what it is, let's say what does John buy and David sells cars, that doesn't sound good. Of course, there are certain. So again, I know perfectly well that there are some exceptions, and they have been noticed first, I think, by George Lakoff back in the 70s. And there's been a lot of discussion what this is about. This is probably related to some sort of differences in discourse structure, but as a rule, this does work. So if you take a certain specific configuration, you can just take a reliable example, a reliable case where you clearly don't get violations of the coordinate structure constraint. And if you use it for testing, this in principle works rather fine. And so these are some of the tests that people use to try to establish whether converbs in East Caucasian are coordinating or subordinating. And of course, as very often in such cases, there is no simple answer. Actually, there is a simple answer for a few languages. So in some languages have been described as, explicitly described as having their converbs perfectly subordinating. So no evidence for coordination. For example, Bogwalal is one well-known case. Ahwach as well, as described by Denis. Dargua as well, from my own data, and Hinuk, among others, are described as being consistently subordinating in showing no properties of coordination. So they allow free embedding, postpositions, postposing the subordinate clause, the coordinate structure constraint is not violated, and so on. So it's violated because it's subordination. All right. So even though in all of these languages, converbs clearly do fulfill the role of close chaining, they in these languages are subordinating. And in others, so there are no languages where converbs are fully coordinating. That's for sure. So that's something which we can be sure about. But in some languages, they have mixed properties. And the way these properties are mixed is, of course, the main question. Because as I said, we can't just say, well, they're mixed. Let's call it something else. We have to understand why exactly the properties are mixed. But something which I just wanted to illustrate here, and which I will illustrate later, is notice that we have the same branch. You have Dargua here, and we have Dargua here. Mihueb, for example, Itzari and Ashti and Hunki. So and especially Hunki and Ashti were described by one and the same person, that is me. So it's not the case of different descriptions. It's the case that within one branch, with the same morphological converb used in the same context, because in all of these languages it's perfectly fine. Close chaining form has different properties, which probably implies that there is no automatic connection between discourse use and syntactic functions. That's important because many people try to derive its, well, I mean, and I think that's a good enterprise in principle, to try and derive the properties of these constructions from their meaning. And that's what actually Kazin and Tisterets hypothesized at the end of their paper, that maybe some of these properties can be derived from the semantics. I'm a bit skeptical, at least in the general sense. Maybe there is a more technical way of doing it, but as a rule, as we see, even in languages where the converbs are used in more or less exactly the same functions, you have so drastic differences in their syntactic behavior, probably it doesn't boil down to semantics. It might, of course, as usual, it probably has a role, but it's not, that does not directly explain the properties. So what is the trend in this mismatch? It's not completely unsystematic. It's not like you have different tests. As I gave a bad example when I said, well, we have different tests and different constructions which all overlap, don't mismatch, and so on. This is not the case in East Caucasian. In fact, there are certain trends. One very common trend, which is attested in many languages. Well, we don't have that many for which we have good descriptions, but for those which we do have descriptions, subordinating properties are associated with causal semantics. So when you do something subordinating with the converb, it enforces, coerces even a causal interpretation. Like this example from Dargois, but this is very widespread. I think it's not just very widespread. It occurs in all of these languages. So in all of these languages where you have mixed properties, some kind of correlation between causality and subordination has been attested. So I give examples from Itsari, but it doesn't matter because more or less the same examples apply to other branches of East Caucasian, for which we have good descriptions. For example, Murat arrived and we left. This could just be a sequence of events, right? He came and we left, not because we didn't like him or there was not enough space for us, we had to maintain the social distancing or whatever, simply because this was how these events occurred in the actual world. But if we embed this subordinate clause, we only get the interpretation that this was the cause of our leaving the room, for example. We, Murat having come, left. So here we only get the interpretation that this was the cause of our leaving. So he came, and because of this, we left. And the same happens when you postpose the clause. If you postpone the clause, you are supposed to have a mirror interpretation of the clause order and the sequence of events. You still get the same sequence, of course, because usually, well, I guess always, unless we have weird time travel situations, in most cases, of course, the causal clause precedes in time the main clause. But you no longer get just the sequential interpretation. You get the causal. We left, Murat having come, and this means we left because Murat came, not when he came, not just when he came. This is one tendency that I think that seems to be almost universal in those languages which have mismatches. Another common property is the tendency to have subordinating properties when the clauses share arguments. So again, I said before that in principle, argument sharing is not obligatory in these languages. So they can be same subject converbs, but very often this is just described as a question of anaphora. So you have zero anaphora, and if we have time, I will mention Alexander Kibrik's paper on this. So you just have different patterns of reference. You can have a zero in the subordinate clause, a full noun phrase. In the main clause, you can have it the other way around. You can have a noun phrase in the subordinate clause and zero in the main clause. So in principle, nothing requires same subject or argument sharing converbs to have different properties, different syntactic structure than converbs that have their own subjects. But suddenly, this does play a role, at least in Sahur, Mehweb, and Ashti, as I'm following the descriptions in the first and second cases. The properties the properties are different. For example, in Ashti, this influences embedding and also focusing. I will show it in a few slides. And in Mehweb and Sahur, also relativization. So relativization is only possible where you have argument sharing. And in Sahur, what's also interesting is that central embedding kind of overrides causal semantics. So if you want to override, if you want to embed the subordinate clause into the main clause, you either have to have a causal interpretation, or you might not have a causal interpretation, but you have to have argument sharing. That's how Kazenin and Tisteres describe this, at least. And I think that's pretty convincing. So, for example, in Sahur, you have either argument sharing or causal semantic. So here is an example from Ashti again to illustrate this effect of same subjecthood and embedding. So in 13, Saleh went out because Ali came, after Ali. It doesn't matter. So if you have two subjects in this variety of Dargois, you cannot embed, even if you have a causal meaning. So unlike Sahur, where both conditions hold, in Ashti only same subject hold. So if you have different subjects, you cannot embed. But if you have the same subject, even if it's expressed in the subordinate clause, it's perfectly fine. So to the university, Ali, having given money, entered. So to the university, it's in the main clause, because the verb enter in lative, probably if he gave money to the university, you would have either dative or interlative marking, right? Because it's a verb of giving, and here it's a spatial adjunct. So in 14 you have same subject hood, and notice that this same subject hood holds even if the subject is expressed in the subordinate clause. So it's not the case of at least not at surface. Not at surface. Again, this is waiting for a full syntactic analysis, but on first glance, it seems that this is not a question of the subordinate clause not having a subject position, for example. It's really a question of having argument sharing. And this is an interesting question. And below is a very sketchy table, so I just revived my old handout from 2010. So some of the tests need some clarification and so on and so forth. But in general, I think it illustrates very fairly how much diversity you can get in these tests, even within one branch of East Caucasian. So coordinate structure constraint is fairly uniform, at least according to the tests I used. Maybe I should reinvestigate it. But as you see in other respects, so for example, the matrix verb, so you always get the morphosyntactic locus test, you get more or less consistent results. But again, there's a difference between kunki, which is consistently subordinating, and the other two varieties. And the other criteria are sensitive to causality or same subject hood, but in different, well, not exactly in the same way again. But still, there seems to be some overlap. But what this overlap is due to, probably not just genetic inheritance, but some general tendencies of how these constructions work. And this is again something that has to be investigated. So how can we how can we actually explain this? I will not provide an explanation at this point. I will just cover the possibilities. So a very frequent, a very popular option is to say that, well, we have coordination, we have subordination, and we have a third type, which is called co-subordination. And this was introduced by Forey and Van Veren. And the idea is that you have subordination, which is both dependent and embedded. You have coordination, which is not dependent and not embedded. And you have co-subordination, which is dependent, but not embedded. So this seems to describe converbs very well, right, at first glance, just impressionistically, right? You have dependency of a certain sense because you have morphological deranking and so on, but you don't have embedding in these cases. However, to paraphrase Leo Tolstoy, the problem with this approach is that all subordination constructions are alike, but each mixed construction is mixed in its own way. So the problem is that you don't get this third class where you can just put everything that is a mismatch. The mismatches are different in different languages. Even across East Caucasian, we saw that there are certain tendencies, but these work in different ways. So it doesn't help us much if we just say, okay, so we know what subordination and coordination is, but co-subordination, this becomes just a generic name for whatever doesn't fit the pattern. In my work, I proposed a different solution, and I built on some very important work by Kurikova and Jekyll and US and Sadek, who assume that you can define coordination and subordination dependently for different levels. So you can say that some constructions, like in Kurikova and Jekyll, they discussed English, one more can of beer and I'm leaving, when you have conditional semantics, but so-called coordinating syntax. US and Sadek discussed other constructions, including converbs in Japanese, and they defined another type, which are semantically subordinate, this should be the other way around. So they described semantic subordination, but syntactic coordination. And this should be semantic coordination because converbs are functionally coordinating, but syntactic subordination. And this explains the differences in the criteria. And I extended this to distinguish three kinds of coordination and subordination. This is couched in LFG, but it doesn't matter because it could also be explained in more mundane terms. So embedding versus non-embedding, which means that this describes tests like linear order, center embedding, position of conjunction, which are related to surface constituent structure. Then they have dependence versus symmetry and F structure in LFG, which describes coordinate structure constraints and morphosyntactic locus, which actually in LFG are the same thing, which I think is actually perfectly correct. And finally, semantics is a different issue, and this is related to various kinds of scope effects. So this, I think, is a more productive approach because mismatches are allowed between levels, but not within levels. And I think this handles diachronic change and mixed constructions fairly well. But there are still open questions. For example, why does causality influence embedding of linear order, which is supposed to be independent from semantics, and why does CSC depend on causality? So this three-level approach doesn't give us simple answers. It's just the first, maybe it could be used as a first step, but in general, I would like to stress that none of the approaches are completely satisfactory at present, and I think we just need more data and more investigation of these constructions and a deeper understanding of how exactly these constraints work. My time is coming to the end. I have a few examples where I wanted to argue that actually linear order doesn't seem to be that, to illustrate that linear order is more of an implicature than a real entailment of the converb construction, because in spoken text you have examples where actually the converbal clause in time precedes the main clause while being follows the main clause even though it's perfective and it's supposed to be anterior. So for example 17 from Shri Dargois, they didn't take him to, it's about a person who wasn't taken to the war, they brought him back, he had gotten prison before that. So she has an explicit temporal adverbial hetisalaka here in a converbal clause, and this means that this converbal clause is interpreted as after that. So you don't have a clear relation, you don't have this sequence of events where you have first clause, second clause, third clause. I don't have time to discuss this in detail, but in principle I just wanted to say that maybe the key to solving this question is to explore in more detail how exactly these linear order effects follow, are embedded in the semantics of the converb rather than follow from some general discourse patterns. Okay, so I will skip. I have a number of slides discussing Kibrik's 2007 paper about coreference patterns, but I think since I'm almost out of time, this has to go to some other time. Okay, so the take-home message, what I wanted to tell you in this lecture. So first of all, in general, East Caucasian languages have complex converb systems which consist of a small set of general converbs and a large set of specialized converbs denoting various adverbial relations. These systems themselves in their makeup are similar, but the forms are different, even among closely related languages. General converbs can be used as a translation equivalent of coordination, but their syntactic properties can be mixed. Well, and a satisfactory solution to this problem is yet an open question, but I think I have highlighted the main salient properties of these possible mismatches, and again, at least we have something to work with at present. Thank you, and here is a Shri proverb which fits what I'm doing right now. So I have to keep my mouth shut now because I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and enlightening talk. And we have a number of questions. I'm going to share my screen to show you the questions. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, yeah, basically, I hope you can see that well. Yeah, and you can address them, and then I'll move the page so that.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, so some of them refer to specific slides. I don't remember what, for example, although I can open the presentation on my computer, which is here. Okay, so let's start from the first question. How do these isoglosses relate? Some of them relate directly because some of them, for example, in some cases, you clearly see that Kubachi is different from all other varieties, and it corresponds to the fact that in general, Kubachi is a bit more distant from the lexico-statistical point of view and from some morphological isoglosses from other varieties. So sometimes you see this very clearly. In other cases, you don't. For example, the isoglosses of the after converb do not seem to correlate with anything because you have Mehueb and Kaitak together, but the other guys are different. So there's not, maybe this is an archaicism. This requires further investigation, but at first glance, you have different clusterings for different converb semantic types. The second question from Timur and Petya, why the additive ra is in bold in one? Is it part of the temporal construction? Yes, I put it in bold because this is something which I didn't have time to discuss in this lecture, and which, for example, Alexander Evgenievich discusses in this paper, which I cited, and which is discussed in some other work. These additive particles very often are almost obligatory parts of this converb construction. So in some languages, well, I guess if you ask the speaker really nicely, you could tell them that you could make them omit this particle, but in actual spoken text, very often these additive particles are almost obligatory. So that's why I highlighted it, but I didn't have time to discuss this. There are sometimes some interesting constraints on the use of these additives. For example, Kibrik argues that in some languages only absolutive nouns take these additives, but if the subordinate clause begins with an ergative noun phrase, it doesn't take the additive. So that's also an interesting topic to discuss, which unfortunately we didn't have time to. Dmitry Zelensky, can the table above example 7 be an artifact of participle using some adjective-like agreement so that they're actually participle stem plus converb polysemy and synthetic form plus participle stem polysemy conspiring to create synthetic form plus converb homonymy? I actually think, I don't know, Samira knows better, but I actually think this is the case. I actually think that the participle somehow, it has agreement and that's why it's different, but the stem is the same. But descriptively, it's different. And first and second, if we can say this, but we still have to provide an analysis of how exactly this agreement gets on the participle. It is still a morphological difference, right? If you have a slot for agreement on one form and no slot on the other. But they might, of course, this suggests that they are diachronically related. Does the Nosha in page 26 specifically exclude Murad? Let me take a look what you're talking about. Yes, so Murad came and we left. You mean together with Murad? Well, there is no inclusivity in Itzari. So, well, it doesn't actually depend on inclusivity because it's not. I don't think that would be expressed differently. This is not. There is no distinction in this case. You just need to. You can have an adverbial phrase which says with him, but if you don't have this phrase, this could have both interpretations. Are these trends something that apply only to East Caucasian or in other families? I'm not aware of any real cross-linguistic study. For example, Bicker's study has a relatively large sample and he doesn't use this kind of criteria. And for someone to have looked into this cross-linguistically at a wider perspective, I'm not aware of such work being done, but I'm imagining that similar trends do hold in other languages and in other families. Timur, as regards the tests, is there a high variation between speakers or other more or less consistent? Well, depends on the variety actually. So in some of them they are consistent, in others you could actually, well, in Kunki everyone is consistent because it's consistently subordinating. In other varieties, well, there is some variation, but I would say that maybe this variation is more due to differences in interpretation of these examples, right, of various construals of semantic relations rather than difference in grammatical constraints. I think that's fairly well defined, but for these Dagwa varieties, as I said, I need to, I actually need to revisit them. But for Tzahur, for example, and for Mehweb, this seems to be fairly well established. At least I haven't found any information about speaker mismatches for Tzahur or Mehweb in the papers. Aygul, can this tendency of embedded converbs to be interpreted as cause be explained somehow by focus? Interesting idea. Maybe this has to be investigated. Yes, because they are sometimes seem to be in preverbal position, and this might be associated with focus. That's a good idea. I think that's something which I have to think about. Thank you. Ken Case, what is the frequency of loanwords amma versus concessive converbs? Amma is almost non-existent in spoken language. In written text, in some languages, yes, but in spoken texts, it's non-existent. And for example, in Lesbian, it's supposed to be more frequent than in other languages, but even in, for example, but even in Lesbian, Martin Haspermat writes in his grammar that older speakers and less educated speakers do not like examples with wa or amma and use converbs instead, even in elicitation. I would, why is Halum Umar in the construction guy named Halum Umar? Well, kind of difficult to say. Well, I think it's more like a citation particle here. That's why, because this converb of the verb to say in Dargwa is grammaticalized as basically a citation particle, and names are used with citation particle, like the so-called Halum Umar, the в кавычках Halum Umar, right? I would probably, yes, so exactly, Timur answered this question for me, sorry. Michael, Misha, in the whenever Gaishnik, is it just habitual, specific, universal? To be honest, I don't know at present. I have to work on the specific semantics of this converb. In other varieties, it's a perfectly conditional converb. So in other varieties, this is just a conditional without any temporal semantics. In Sharif, this is a bit unusual. That is used in such function. Samira, the part, yes, okay, thank you very much. So synchronically, at least, this is an answer to Dmitri's question. Synchronically, at least in idea, this is a totally separate form. If you have the same
We're experiencing some technical problems, I guess. We lost our speaker. But luckily, Oleg had time to go through all of the questions, and now there are only a few comments left. So I would like to thank the audience for being with us this evening and asking very interesting questions. And I also would like to thank Linguistic Convergence Laboratory for organizing this course, which I personally very much enjoyed, and I hope the people in the audience also enjoyed it. I also thank Oleg. Whatever happened to him?
Lost the connection, but it's back now.
Okay, so the connection is restored. Very good. Mm-hmm. So would you like to say something more with regards to the comments or questions?
Yeah, I just started saying that synchronically then in idea, the forms are distinct, but diachronically, since this is a petrified gender marker, something what Dmitry said could be the case, but then you have to explain why it occurred, what is the syntactic mechanism of getting gender on the participle. Well, other comments, Bahandan, I think you discussed this without me, so thank you very much. And thank you everyone for your questions, for your attention, and for the thank yous that I see in the chat. Thank you very much to you as well, and season's greetings to you as well. And I hope the coming year will bring less problems to us, specifically in terms of field work, which is very relevant to all of us, but in all other respects as well. Thank you very much. And again, as I said, I'm very honored to be speaking here.
Thank you very much for delivering this wonderful talk, and it was great to see you all.